Welcome to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. It's Alice again, your friendly neighbourhood Australian, just taking over the mic for a short time. This is a conversation between Matthew and I about, I guess, what they used to call in the 80s and 90s the war of the sexes. I feel like if you could print out every SLEERICKETS episode and put them in a filing cabinet, the poetry file would be pretty huge. There'd be plenty of stuff in there, which is appropriate for a poetry podcast. You would have a movies file that would have a few episodes in there. You'd have a parenting file, which honestly I think we could put more in that one. And then you would have the file that this episode belongs in, alongside a few others, the file titled Men Behaving Badly. So the reason we're having this conversation today is that Matthew and I were contacted by a listener who wanted to share a couple of stories about her experience out there in the poetry world with poetry dudes. And as you can probably guess from my tone, these were not positive experiences. These were creepy experiences, bad experiences, experiences that left her feeling not great. We heard those stories and we talked about it between ourselves, and we thought, is there a way that we can have a conversation about this that threads the needle and doesn't become a PSA, but also doesn't upset and offend everyone? I don't know which side of the line we've fallen on. I suspect maybe the latter. But I think if nothing else, what we've managed to do is to show over the course of this conversation, the second half of which is on The Secret Show, just how many contradictions there are in this situation. We start talking about a Curtis Sittenfeld story published in The New Yorker called A for Alone. I would recommend you go and check that one out. We also discussed a couple of articles, one of which was published in Vox and one of which was published in The Guardian, both of which we'll link to in the show notes. And these articles are about the question of whether we are currently in the midst of a backlash to the Me Too movement. We also talk a little bit about Helen Garner's book, The First Stone. If you're an American listener, you haven't heard of this book. It was published in the 90s. Its subtitle is Some Questions About Sex and Power. And we attempt in this episode to come up with some kind of maxim, some kind of directive as to how to proceed, given all the contradictions that we're working with here. And I think you can probably already guess that we don't come to any really solid conclusions, but we give it a red hot go. So join us as we attempt to decide once and for all who run the world.
Yeah, I enjoyed the Sittenfeld story. I always forget the experience I have reading her, which is like, oh, you can just do gossip and have that be a fun, like, and it's good. Like, that's the thing. It's like every story of hers I've read is totally enjoyable. Yeah, like the feeling I always have reading her is like, oh, you just talk and be charming and just give us a bunch of gossip and it's juicy and delicious. And of course, like it part of what makes her good at what she does is that she makes it look easy. But it's
easy. She's also such a master of the marital compromise, like the deadly deals that couples make between them. I'm not going to talk to you about that as long as you never mention this. I don't really see many people write about that. At least, not that directly. She just seems to take it as a matter of course. Like, this is what being in a relationship long-term is.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like it's necessarily a condemnation either. Like it just feels like it's sort of like, well, you're making this compromise. You could be making a different one. I do think I read Wednesday's Child recently, which is I think the latest collection by Yi-Yun Lee, and she does that I think quite well in that collection as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just talking about different sorts of like there's a recurring, that one is very much one that, as with Francis Levison's collection and as with, I feel like a lot of Joanna's stories, it almost feels like multiple parallel universes passes at the same essential circumstance where like there's several suicides or like group suicides or child suicides, and there's also there are these multiple different versions of a like young teenage girl who's very rich in a very restrictive, Chinese society, basically getting her having a big crush on her teacher, who's 20 years older than her, and then getting her rich and powerful dad, who's high up in the Communist Party, to make her teacher marry her. But then there's this sort
Right.
of,
That
it's like,
happens
but then of
multiple
course, like,
times.
right, like, well, there are different versions of it because like it's a collection of stories, not a novel, but it definitely feels like she's drawing very much from life, and
Mm.
because it's almost like she's not shy about saying like, I did one story that sort of involved this kind of thing that presumably some version of this happened in her own, like to a friend of hers in China, because then in another story you'll see like a slightly refracted version of it again.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, doing that recently because I think I said to you in a message, I've got this poem that I just can't win with this thing. But I feel so attached to it because I'm like, I just need to tell this story. And I think I've just realized recently that like I could tell it this way, but I could also tell it another way later. It doesn't have to necessarily be like perfectly, like I want the poem to be good, but I don't have to get it all into this one vehicle. I can I can do it again later. So,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And it, I don't know, I do feel like there's a sleight of hand that can be really useful when hitting a roadblock. Did you ever read the Douglas Adams sci-fi books?
Yeah, one or two. Yeah.
They have the infinite improbability engine, I think is
Mm,
what it's called. That is like
yeah.
how they perform faster than light travel. That basically it's this engine that makes all of these infinitely improbable things happen, including this particular course across the universe. But the breakthrough was they couldn't figure out how to build one. The way they built one was finally that they built a finite improbability engine, and then they just asked it to make the infinite one. And like Borges talked about, like he was stuck and he couldn't figure out how to write. He wanted to write and he couldn't figure out how to write for so long. And so he finally just decided to pretend he had already written the thing he wanted to write and then just write an article about it.
Yeah.
Like those are his stories. Or yeah, like I feel like the Emma Klein story that we talked about ages ago, I thought was really helpful for me because it, I often have a tendency to like want to write about sort of like dark or depressing situations.
Mm,
And part of what she showed was possible is like, oh, well, what if you just wrote about it as a triumph? Instead of having to like wallow in all the awfulness of it, write about it
yeah.
as if the guy, like, because the guy thinks it's great. The guy thinks everything worked out fine.
Mm, mm.
And it sort of it frees you to just come at it in a different way.
Look at it from a different angle. Yeah.
But yeah, you and I had a conversations and exchanged a bunch of emails, and then you read some things and sent some notes, and I read some things and sent some notes. Do you have a plan?
Do I have a plan? I have a lot of trepidation. I mean, I always feel a bit nervous, but I think I feel extra nervous today because I have been thinking about this conversation since our conversation with the listener. And I've realized that I have a lot of quite contradictory thoughts. And I think that's a
Yes.
problem. And I also have a lot of strong emotion.
Yeah.
And I'm just hopeful that in talking about this, that won't eclipse what I'm trying to say or muddy what I'm trying to say. But I can attempt to set this up if you would like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think like it would be great to give like just a kind of a
Hmm.
factual description of the occasion for this conversation. And then I'm with you, I think, in having the thought the thought I keep having over and over again as I read through the stuff and think through the stuff is like multiple potentially contradictory things are true at the same time.
Yeah.
And then, but then
Yeah.
what I definitely want to hear, and I don't know what the best order will be, but what I definitely would love to hear is just sort of like a venting in the order of things that you feel strongly about. Like I would love to just like hear out what the feelings are, and
Yeah.
then try to work out maybe some other things from, because then the other question, which we may get to only by failing to get to it, is lessons. Lessons to learn, maxims to derive.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll try to give a factual setup. We are having this conversation today because Matthew was contacted by a listener who wanted to share some stories of bad behavior on the part of male poets. We then had a follow up conversation, the three of us, and we wanted to try to address that theme, for lack of a better word, somehow.
Yeah.
And I sent Matthew some material to read. I don't know if any of it is all that useful. We also read a short story by Curtis Sittenfeld, which was great on this topic.
Recommended by Joanna.
Yeah, which Joanna recommended, which was fantastic. And maybe I'll start by asking you this question that I posed in my notes,
Mm-hmm.
which is, was anything in what we heard from this listener surprising to you at all?
It wasn't surprising. The facts of it weren't surprising. Maybe the salience was. Um, it's
The
sort of like,
salience?
yeah, well, I mean, this is how I think about like readers. And with, when you have a good reader for your work, you exchange work with, who's able to look at your work and help you make it better.
Hmm.
Seldom is the reader who's looking at your work going to tell you a thing that you did not know before. But in order to do anything well, you have to know 50,000 things. And sometimes it's just a question of which of those were you thinking of at the moment. Because like
Hmm.
very often in my experience is that on both ends of like good writing advice, it's like, if I'm reading something for someone or someone else is reading something for me, my experience is that usually when I point something out, like, hey, what if you thought about this kind of question here, or somebody makes a similar suggestion to me, the response almost always, if it's good advice, will be, "Oh, of course, yeah, no, yeah, 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 yeah." That's exactly right. I completely am. Not only am I already familiar with the principle that you're reminding me of, but like I already agree with it and endorse it and try to pursue it, but I lost sight of it here because I was thinking of 49,000 other things.
Hmm.
So I think partly I was not, none of the stories she told me did I really think of as being like fundamentally new events or like things I didn't know ever happened, but maybe I didn't know they happened as much, didn't have necessarily happen in the same manner, didn't happen now, like I wasn't thinking about them as being so prominent as probably, it's sort of like you, and I'll let you elaborate later, but like you mentioned going to the beach in Australia and having to be aware of sharks, and like that's, of course that's like a thing that could happen, but like it's it is, it's not something you necessarily would be thinking about during most beach trips, at least in the States. And of course it varies very much depending on what coast you're on, but it's, once you're reminded of it, you say like, oh, of course shark attacks are a problem. Of course that's a thing to be worried about.
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
just that was mostly my response, was like, oh, this brings this sort of behavior into a higher degree of salience than it had been holding previously. It's just sort of like one of the many things that could happen that I knew generally was possible and did sometimes happen.
Yeah. And it's probably important to say at the start too that we are not going to get into any detail about the stories, these particular stories that the listener shared just to protect her.
Yeah, we're not trying to we're not trying to retell her story in
No.
an anonymized way. But maybe we will just talk about some of the concerns or kinds of behavior that it brought up.
Yeah. For me, what surprised me was the fact that I was once again so disappointed to hear these stories. I was
Mm,
surprised at my own disappointment. I think of myself as somebody who takes the sharks in the water completely for granted and who is always aware of them.
yeah.
However, I'm apparently not that person because every time somebody says, "Hey, there was a shark attack at that beach," I'm like, "Fucking shark attack now? Again? At that beach?
Yeah.
I can't believe the sharks are at that beach too. This sucks." So I get disappointed all over again.
Yeah.
And where my strong feelings come in is when I think about really just the most recent history of this conversation, beginning around 2017-18 with the accusations that came out against Harvey Weinstein, and from there, the sort of snowballing of the Me Too movement. I feel like a complete idiot for having such faith in that movement. I wouldn't go so far as to say I was excited about it, but I had a lot of hope that men hearing these stories in such volume would really change behavior.
Yeah.
Why on earth did I think that? That's an insane thought. But just to add to that too, like that's where I start to get quite cynical and despondent and frustrated. But I did have this conversation, like a version of this conversation with a very dear male friend the other day. He's only in his early 30s and he came round and I was like, "Hey, I'm just getting ready to have this conversation. I want to know what you think about my take here," which my take is essentially Me Too had very limited positive effects
Yeah.
and mostly seems to have made things worse. And he was like, I could just watch his face just sort of falling the more I spoke.
Yeah.
And he was like, Alice, it's not that bad, and he sort of
Yeah.
explained to me that it did have an effect on him hearing these stories. It did change his awareness and possibly even his behavior to some degree. And that was the next question I wanted to ask you was, what was it like for you kind of before? Was there a before and after in terms of watching this conversation, or were you more
Yeah.
sort of like, I
Uh,
get it?
there were phases of it, right?
Mm,
There was the initial phase, which was shock and horror. So many women. I mean, I had already known about a lot of the women I know personally having some, sometimes really horrible, even violent experiences, and I heard from even more. That some version of this, some kind of sexual assault. I think initially all seemed to be framed in terms of sexual assault,
yeah.
and and I was appalled to learn that so many women had experienced this, and I became aware that like there is definitely a type of man who will behave very differently if there are no other men around, because
Mm,
there's a behavior that I realized I was just not, it wasn't happening when I was around, and so I didn't notice it, and so I didn't think it was happening, but it was happening when I was not around, and I was glad that people were calling attention to it. I was glad that there seemed to be some real consequences for some of the people responsible. I also think then there were multiple phases of the movement, which is not to say that there aren't legitimately different tiers and types of bad sexual behavior that do matter, right? And that maybe you're not a victim of sexual assault, but you're a victim of sexual harassment, and that can take a few different forms. I think if you if you watched the movement happen, there were definitely people who, from very very early on, were crying out, "This has gone too far," right? There were people saying that throughout. They weren't all of them wrong the whole way through. There were people saying that from the beginning. There were people saying it later. The movement also continued to change. I don't know how. I mean, it may have been different in Australia, but like here, there's sexual assault, there's sexual harassment, there's sexual misconduct, which then begins to be a slightly slipperier and softer question. I think about like the Aziz Ansari story. I think about even Cat Person, which was sort of about a guy who was creepy and tone deaf and then a jerk and then like a bad date. And then the story sort of needed the last thing he said to be whore. So that it kind of confirms that he's an out and out villain and not just sort of a loser. So I think that then the widespread application of the term sexual misconduct, I think, caused some real problems. We can talk more if we want to about the Juno Diaz case. You sent an article from Vox, an article from The Guardian. I found like both of them very, very frustrating. The Guardian one I thought was much, much worse. I thought it was just very incompetently written. But both of them contain some like really important facts, particularly about things that are happening right now at the hands of the Trump administration, as well as the Dobbs decision making it possible for states across the country to outlaw abortion, make women's lives much worse, and that has downstream effects. It's not even it affects things that aren't even abortion because of the kind of fear it strikes into the hearts of doctors. So like very simple example, if you are as a doctor told you could be prosecuted for participating in what could be considered an abortion, then you're going to become extremely stingy and cautious about how you administer pills to purge an already deceased fetus. Because you still need a medical abortion a medical abortion or a surgical abortion to remove dead tissue, right? When women have a miscarriage, often the fetus doesn't emerge on its own, particularly if it's far along. And so doctors then will be very cautious, understandably, because they don't know how they're going, whether or not they're going to be prosecuted. That then causes like medical treatment problems for women way down the line, even far away from any question of actual abortion. I think like similarly, and again, like you're a little like when I hear conservatives say like, oh, well, why would a doctor, doctors, they can read the law. They know what's legal and what's not. They don't know what's going to be applied. They don't know how it's going to be applied. They don't know what prosecutor is going to get a wild hair, depending on the state they're in, depending on what fucking religion that prosecutor happens to practice. Right. I think like if you can recognize that, which conservatives often seem unable to do, then like you got to recognize how then similarly we're seeing certain kinds of decisions being handed down, certain kinds of language being applied, and then would read that atmosphere as one in which like, hey, it's not that I'm performing abortions. It's I don't know if I'm going to get prosecuted. And so it's going to radically change the way I look at things. So I think like Me Too as a movement did accomplish some real things. It does seem, I think like the big problem with like backlash conversations is again, like, what are we talking about? Like what, by Me Too, what do you mean? Because if what you mean is things got really hot on Twitter for a while with this hashtag, I'm not sure what the consequences of that were. Like, I think like that was a lot of people making much of their own. There was a lot of people drawing a lot of attention to themselves. There was a lot of people causing, writing a lot of think pieces. There were then next to that some real legal cases. There was a little bit of legislation that changed. There were policies that changed in companies. A lot of things that happened to the good, right? But I don't know. Like the lesson that both of these writers seem to draw is, hey, the concrete effects, the measurable concrete legislative effects of Me Too or legal effects of Me Too were sort of paltry in the end. And so why are people having such an intense backlash to those small effects? That's not what they're having a backlash to. They're having a backlash to the unholy state of the national conversation for several years in a row. Right. Like it was like you can say Me Too needed to happen. You can say it did a lot of real good. You can say it didn't finish doing all of the good it needed to do, which it didn't. Right. It didn't bring about the necessary changes that it needed to bring about. But like it also threw an absolute fucking tantrum, fucked up a lot of people's lives. Some of them deserved to be fucked up. Some didn't. Scared the shit out of a lot of people. Again, I think like it's a little bit like gun. I mean, it's a little bit like the conservative argument about gun laws. Like, pass all the gun laws you want, that doesn't stop the school shooter. He's a criminal. He's shooting up schools. Pass all, pass all the sexual harassment, like scare the shit out of people as much as you want. It's not going to stop like the 2% of men who are doing 90% of the sexual harassing, right? Those guys are going to keep on trucking. It's everybody else who's suddenly going to become, who's not going to, for example, invite any women to a conversation, because why would you bother to invite women? I mean, I've heard from small business owners, including women, things like, oh God, I don't want to hire women or minorities right now because there's just too much trouble. There's too many things they can do to fuck up your life, right? You think like, fuck, that's the opposite of what's supposed to be happening. That's the exact opposite of what's supposed to be happening. So yeah, I mean, I found Me Too to be shocking and horrifying and really important. And I thought, as with like many social movements, it lost its thread and started it lost its focus, and it stopped doing the work it needed to do, and in the meanwhile made life really miserable for people in a way that didn't ultimately advance its ends. And I think if you think that, like, what did both, there was an article cited this thing that I just, like, it made my head spin. It's cited as evidence of like the extreme deranging effects of the current backlash. And by 2024, 65% of men between the ages of 18 and 29 agreed with the statement that guys can have their reputations destroyed just for speaking their mind. Is that an insane and extreme opinion? I mean, for one thing, it seems like that's true for all people across all of time. Like, not just in this case. Like, yes, at any moment, most people it's been possible for you to destroy your life by speaking your mind, depending on what speaking your mind means. Now, it may mean because you speak your mind and you're a fucking Nazi. It may mean you speak your mind and the atmosphere of the moment is such that that you lose your job or you lose this or that. But like, that's not a crazy opinion to have. It's certainly not a crazy opinion to have after the full heat of, maybe I should say, the heat with sometimes lacking light of like Me Too at its peak. I mean, I have similar like regrets about some of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think, like, holy shit, was necessary. Holy shit, there was a lot that needed to happen. Holy shit, a lot did not get done. And if you look at that and you say, like, look at the few actual concrete changes that improve the lives of Black people in America, and if you're having a backlash to that, you're crazy. Well, that's true. That's not what people are having a backlash to. They're having a backlash to like massive, incredibly destructive riots that happen. Again, on top of other things, like, it wasn't one thing happening, but like, it's possible for a social movement to make an enormous stink without actually affecting a lot of change, and then to put people off in a way that then helps keep them from achieving their ends that they still need to achieve, because there still isn't justice for women. There still isn't justice for Black people. Sorry, I talked for way too long. You should talk for a while.
You said a mouthful there. I was also going to pull up that statistic. Actually, no, I wanted to look at this other one about the massive decline in support for feminism as a cause over just 2 years. So in 2020, 60% of men across parties, Democrat and Republican, agreed that feminism was, quote unquote, empowering, and only 34% said it was outdated. In 2022, 62% of young Republican men said that feminism is a net negative. I mean, these are not equivalent measurements.
Sure, yeah. They're not quite the same question.
Yeah. And 46% of young Democratic men agree. That really shocked me. 46%, nearly half of young Democratic men agree that feminism is a net negative for society. That doesn't surprise me, but I do feel very disappointed to read that.
Can I ask you a question about it? Just
sure.
Because the question, I kept wanting either of those articles, because they both cited that, some version of that, and I kept wanting either of them to propose something. What is feminism?
Yeah.
Because I think like my suspicion is that in both of those cases, like, the answers to those questions about feminism, I don't know if you ask those men to elaborate in this form of a sentence, that did not
Yeah.
include the word feminism, what they were saying, I'm not sure you could have gotten any real sentences.
The word is now damaged and tainted for a lot of reasons, a big one of which is the trans exclusionary radical feminist movement.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it becomes a shorthand for a lot of things. I think if you took those men to the side and you said, "Do you think that women are lesser than men?"
Right.
I think those guys would say, "No, I don't think that."
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's always been my working definition of feminism. If you believe that you have equal rights regardless of your gender, then you're a feminist.
Okay. But that's how I feel when I talk to Elijah about God. I'm like, I don't believe in God. He's like, yeah, but don't you love your daughters? Like, I do love my daughters. Like, that feeling you have, what if that's what God is? Like, well, okay, fine. But like, I thought, what is this? Why would I bother to call that God? Like, if I believe that men and women are equal, why would I bother to call that feminism? What is it? What are we talking about now? Like, you don't believe in community? I guess I do believe in community. Aren't you a communist? Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? Like, what is this thing we're doing? Right? Like, is it defined by it feels like a real Mott and Bailey problem. Like, is it defined by the most broad, inoffensive possible definition of it? Or is it defined by the behavior and public opinions of the people who most loudly claim it? You can ask that about any number of movements. You could ask that about liberalism, conservatism, Christianity, right, et cetera. Like, very few people are going to say, like, oh, the basic teachings of Jesus are bullshit, right? Most people are not going to say that, but like, it doesn't make them Christians.
No, but I'm just saying that for me, that's always been my own working definition of what it is. It's many things. It's had
Yeah, yeah.
up to four separate waves focused on various different rights for women. It's had a lot of aspects to it. It's had a lot of flavors. It's
Yeah,
had a lot of
yeah.
incarnations. That's just my most basic working definition.
My experience has been every woman I've ever dated, girl and woman I've dated. I'm trying to think of if there are any exceptions. No, I'm not. I think like every single woman I've ever dated or girl when I was a teenager, dating teenagers, would describe herself as a feminist. Sometimes like in a very dedicated way. And so I don't think I would ever say it's a net negative, it's bad, because I think it's meant a lot to a lot of people I cared about. And so I think like, all right, great. You're great. Like, great, go for it. It's never made any sense to me to call myself a feminist because, again, I guess as with politics, like even when I was registered as a Democrat in order to be able to, vote in primaries, I wouldn't ever describe myself like what would it mean for me to say I'm a Democrat? Wouldn't really mean anything. The question is, what do I do? What choices do I make? Now I'm registered as nothing so that I can vote in either primary because sometimes I vote in Republican primaries just to vote for whoever's not Trump. um, but but it's not like it doesn't. I don't know. I think like I don't know what it would mean for me to say that, and I do know. Here's the thing. I don't have a bad. The word doesn't have a bad connotation to me. I don't. It doesn't make me think ill of women. It's like all like including my wife. I clearly like women who call themselves feminists. What I do confess is that I have pretty bad associations with men who vocally claim to be feminists. I do think like so like if I maybe you do think that about yourself, but like if it gets to the point where I bought like it's possible for me to hear you call yourself a feminist and you're a man, like I don't know. The associations I have are not good, fair or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, some feminists would argue that that's not possible.
Well, that men can't be feminists.
Yeah,
Well, so that, but then they clearly don't have the same definition you do, right?
right. Like I said, it's
Yeah,
broad
yeah, yeah,
church,
yeah, yeah.
but we're getting very far away from
Yeah,
our
we are.
goal
We
here.
are.
Maybe the next place to focus on is this question that both of these articles brought up, which is if Me Too had aligned itself more closely with workers' rights, then maybe it would have won more people over to the cause. And we keep talking about it as if again it's one thing,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
Me
yeah.
Too isn't an it. Obviously, it's a conversation which had many, many, many people involved in it. But
Yeah.
yeah, one of these articles says it's worth remembering that Me Too is at its core a workplace safety movement. And the stories that launched it into public consciousness were about people, mostly women, accusing their professional superiors, mostly men, of using their professional power to facilitate sexual harassment and assault. And this article also ends by making a really excellent point, I think, about specifically Harvey Weinstein and how,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
this writer sees the conversation. I don't know if I necessarily see it this way, but this writer sees the conversation as focusing too much on a few specific examples of powerful men like Weinstein.
Mm-hmm.
And the writer says, rather than doing the difficult work of redistributing power and thinking about what a meaningful response to various forms of sexual misconduct should look like, we can simply point to Weinstein's fate and say, see, we fixed it.
Yeah.
And and that is, I think, a really useful way of looking at it, because another important facet of feminism to me is that question of redistributing power. So
Mm-hmm.
things get very dangerous very quickly when you have one person, male, female, anyone at the top, who has too much power.
Yeah.
One of our first conversations was about the movie The Assistant with Julia Garner,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which paints this portrait, a picture of this really beautifully,
Based on the Harvey Weinstein. Yeah.
which is based on Weinstein. Yeah. Everybody in that scenario knows that there's something deeply wrong. None of them have the power to change it, because the minute that they speak up, they will lose their job and they have to leave the city, and they have to shelve their dreams essentially.
Yeah.
So I think this is it's a good point. It's the kind of point you can only make post hoc though, because
Mm-hmm.
yes, probably there should have been, or there could have been more in the Me Too conversation about, hey, you know what? It's not just my male boss who is making these veiled threats at me, or like making explicitly sexual comments in the team meeting.
Yeah.
It's also his boss, who's a woman, who's actually kind of a bully.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And she makes us work on the weekend.
The same
That
people championing the
sucks.
Me Too movement were defending fucking Amy Klobuchar for throwing staplers at her aides. They were
Right,
defending her
okay.
as like, well, she's a girl boss. She's really, a man wouldn't be accused of being a bad boss for throwing things and screaming and blaming his minor errors on his staff. All of this horrible behavior that she was guilty of toward her own staff, and like it just felt like, okay, all
Well,
right, if
that's
that's the.
probably true, but it's also very much
I
beside the
mean, it's a
point.
little. It
That
was a little
behavior
harder
is
to say that in
bad.
2019, right? When like lots of men had just been thrown out of their jobs for that. They were, they weren't thrown out of their jobs for that. They were thrown out of their jobs for pinching bottoms while doing that, which also sucks and shouldn't happen, and they should lose their jobs for that.
But yeah, that behavior is obviously indefensible no matter who's doing it. But I think it's only sort of 5, 6, 7 years down the road when we are seeing these minimal gains and a lot of fear and a lot of really open derision of
Yeah,
this movement, that we can turn around and say, damn, we really should have got the guys more on board. We could have talked
yeah,
more
yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
general workplace fairness. At the time, Me Too was a tantrum.
Yeah,
And I think the mistake of the movement was expecting anyone to care, really, about the
yeah,
tantrum.
yeah,
But this is what I said to my guy friend the other day, and his face fell, and he said, "Oh my God, Alice, we did care."
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I think, but
Both of
the
those things are true, right?
difficulty, yeah, both those things are true. But the difficulty is that the men who perpetuate this kind of behavior that the listener brought to us see a tantrum
Yeah.
and go, look at those hysterical, angry feminists.
But is the movement to convince them? Like the guys we were talking about are guys who will, like explicitly ask a quid pro quo. Sleep with me and I'll get you published. Sleep with me and I'll get you a job. Guys who will take advantage of fame, of their position at a conference, to get a woman alone to proposition her, will, grab or grope or, those guys are, I mean, I think in many cases they're actually psychopaths. Is the goal of the movement to persuade them?
No, this is where I keep getting myself confused because obviously the goal isn't to persuade them. But I think the difficulty is that, as you said, this behavior happens to people in isolation or
Yeah.
at least when other men aren't
Yeah,
around.
yeah, yeah.
And so it doesn't, this is my darkest timeline kind of take on this is like, it doesn't matter how many men you convince, how many, decent men are terrified to do the wrong thing. It doesn't matter how much ground we gain in that area. This stuff just keeps happening. The sharks are always there. And that's where I feel
Yeah.
like, to bring up a text that nobody's read, the woman at the end of Marilyn French's The Women's Room, which is a second wave feminist novel, who at the end of the book essentially goes mad, leaves her friends and family, and walks the coastline as an insane person because she can't exist in the world. And I get to a place where I feel such empathy with that character so often because I don't know, I think part of me is just like I've got too much hope and too much optimism, and every time I hear a story like this I'm just like fucking sharks.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I shouldn't be surprised.
So here's a probably stupid question, but one that feels like it at least is somewhat relevant. A lot of the people we're hearing stories about, a lot of the people who were sort of most guilty or sort of caught out at being, most abusive during the Me Too movement were people in positions of great power. In the literary world, most of the examples I have heard from, whether it's just long taking too much weird, creepy advantage of a long, sniffy, groping hug, or whether it's pulling people aside, or whether it's literal offering quid pro quos. Where Joanna tonight was talking about a woman, she was, her age, our age, who was in a workshop with her, and like the year after they were in a workshop together, married this guy who's 30 years older than her, who's a very, very famous, celebrated poet, built up her career. She's still married to him. He's fucking ancient. I mean, that's not sexual harassment. It's not sexual misconduct. It's fucking weird, and it lines up with it. Like a lot of the guys, at least in the literary world, that I've heard the stuff about, and I continue to hear the stuff about, are baby boomers, and it does seem like there is some question of like these are guys who don't. It's not just that they have status now. It's that the world they grew up in was one in which it really was much more understood that men could sort of take advantage of women, or use, as both my mom and the listener we talked to have talked about, like, professors, whether they were writers or not, often sort of a charming, charismatic male professor would often sort of treat his graduate students as a dating pool or a harem. This is just sort of understood, kind of winked at, smiled at, understood as normal, fine. If for guys who grew up in that world and were successful in that world and did all of that and wrote poems like The Ghost in the Martini in that world,
Yeah.
not that, I mean, Heck's a little older than baby boomers, and dead now. How much of this problem, like, I don't really think you're going to persuade those guys. Like, I don't think a movement is going to change their mind very much. It seems, I'm always skeptical of progressives who say, hey, the older generation needs to die. There's still a part of me that thinks the older generation in this case needs to die, and that will change a lot of the problem, particularly given that the men who are our age just it's not that same world. Like that, it is a different world. Hey, Jose,
Yeah.
do you want to come say hi?
Josie.
You want to come give you a kiss? Okay, I'll come give you a kiss. Josie got her black belt this weekend. It was a very grueling
Oh wow,
deal, but she
congratulations,
was pretty
Josie.
impressive. We were very proud of her. Do you want to say hi, or do you just want to go? You want me to come? Okay.
Hey sweetie.
Hi.
Hi, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a big deal. How was it? Was it scary?
Yeah, I'm tired.
Yeah, right. How long? Like, how many hours did you have to?
7 hours.
7 hours. That's
Yeah.
crazy. It's good to see you. I'll let you go to bed. Welcome back to Poetry Says, episode 301. Today's episode, we will be discussing Kesha's new single, Delusional.
Oh, I've
Always
not heard it.
bang. It's so good. Um, so, oh my God, it's
The
so
gr-
good to
the,
see
the Grim
Josie.
Reaper as the handmaiden of progressivism.
Yeah. So now I'm regretting not, there was one article I didn't send you, which I'm regretting not sending to you now. It's on the cut, and I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head. But because I've had that thought too. Okay, all right. We're not going to win people over. Mostly it is older dudes. At a certain point, this problem will solve itself. It's a very cruel and dark thing to say, but that is a
Yeah,
thought that I sometimes have.
totally.
Um, and then you read the most basic thing about dating culture today. And this
Jesus
article in the cut that I
Christ.
was going to send you is all about how women dating at the moment find themselves, in bed with a man and regularly, like many stories were included in this article. Regularly, what he will do at a certain point is just start to choke her.
Oh my God, the
Like
choking thing.
the choking
What the
thing
fuck is
and the
up with
slapping
this?
thing.
Choking and
And
slapping?
yeah, the choking and
What?
the slapping.
What? What?
So this obviously comes from
Oh
pornography.
my God. I don't
And
like
I don't know that
fucking.
these
Is
men are
that
doing
fun?
this in any kind of like,
Is
is
that
it
fun for
fun?
either party? Well, no, but like presumably somebody like what? What?
I It's
Oh,
sort of tragic to me because in my mind it's like the guy doesn't want to do it, but he's like, I think this is what I'm supposed to do. And
right,
she's
right,
like,
right, right.
oh, he thinks that this is what I'm into. I guess I better be into it.
Ugh.
Yeah, what a nightmare. But yeah, so there's that kind of thing going on. If you look at, yeah, any number of online conversations around
Yeah,
dating
yeah,
at the
yeah,
moment, the
yeah.
overall feeling is one of deep pessimism. And this is where I'm going to bring in my favorite article of the last couple of years, which is called On Heteropessimism,
Yeah, yeah.
which I really, if people only do two things after they listen to this episode, one would be read On Heteropessimism. And then the other thing that I do want to say to anybody listening who thinks that I sound unnecessarily inflammatory or that I'm overstating things, I would just say go to the women in your life and ask them about their experiences of this kind.
Mhm.
And then crucially, don't say anything while they're speaking. Just truly just listen. You don't need to solve anything. Truly just listen. Just take it in and then just know that that's part and parcel of what's going on. But anyway,
Yeah,
this heteropessimism article is a good challenge to this despondency that I have.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna quote a paragraph of it
Please, please, please.
by a writer called Asa Sarasin. It was published in October 2019. And she says, social movements such as Me Too demonstrate the frightening urgency with which heterosexual culture needs to be revolutionized. Heteropessimism, so we could basically summarize that as the conversation under the heading Men Are Trash.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Heteropessimism might seem like a starting point of that revolution, but in
Hmm.
reality, its anesthetizing force has had the ironic effect of stalling some of the momentum of these movements. If heterosexuality becomes shorthand for misogyny, the proper object of critique falls away. To be permanently, preemptively disappointed in heterosexuality is to refuse the possibility of changing straight culture for the better. And that's really bracing for me to read because I do get into that headspace of thinking there's nothing to be done. We
Yeah,
are not only are we not winning, but we are actively losing. Like we're losing men at a rate of knots, you know,
yeah,
look at the latest Trump win, look at the abortion ban, look at all this shit.
yeah, yeah.
It's only getting worse. I don't know what to do. I, you know, I do live with a man and I love men and I like being friends with men specifically. It's not
Yeah.
just that my friends happen to be men. I like being friends with men.
You sent me a list of friend. I won't say the precise context, but you're like all of my friends in X context, and you listed their names, and they were all men.
Yeah, no, I can list the context. All my friends in poetry are men. Like that's what it is. Except for Lou.
Right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, but I like that. To be permanently and preemptively disappointed in heterosexuality is to refuse the possibility of changing straight culture for the better. So if we look at the conversation, say, around the choking thing, men
Oh my god,
during
I'm so
sex,
fucking
assuming
weirded out by
that
that.
what women want is choking, then, and we say, well, they've all been brainwashed by porn and we can't save them. And God, if only I were a lesbian, then the conversation closes down. We don't go anywhere from there. And this is where I get really stuck between these two impulses, one of which is, damn it, we should have offered a path to repair. We should have made that conversation more palatable. We shouldn't have been quite so angry. Look at this, we fucked everything. And the other part of me that is just like, of course we were angry. How are we
Yeah,
going
yeah,
to
yeah,
do
yeah.
this in a way that was not angry?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a
Yeah.
very distinct shift that I remember because I remember being extremely sympathetic to the Me Too movement and then becoming not, I never thought like, oh, this should never have happened. But I definitely thought there was a point at which I thought like any further conversation I am hearing on this subject seems not to be accomplishing good things and seems actively to be accomplishing bad things or to be merely making a stink. And that
Mm.
turn was the turn from some men are a real problem, and you may not be aware if you're a man. This is a problem we all need to address. We all need to be aware of it. Some of your friends, maybe even your family members, like you men may be hanging out with guys who, when you're not around, are really a problem. And that needs to be addressed. I was 100% sympathetic to that awareness raising campaign. And then there was a shift to men are trash. And my response to that was, okay, so you don't want to have a conversation with me. Like before, I was trying to listen to what you were saying. Now you're saying, not only should I believe you, but that I'm trash regardless, and I'm the problem. So my response was not like you all need to shut up and stop what you're doing. My response was like, okay, I'm pulling away. Like you're telling me to go away, so I'm going to go away. I'm going to go have some conversations with some men about some other things, and I'm not sure. Like, there was a movement that got kind of wrapped up into the whole manosphere that I was interested in. I suspect it ended up being just sort of a different branding for a similar kind of thing because there were incels, there were like pickup artist types, manosphere type. But then there was this movement that was called the MGTOW movement. Do you know this?
Oh, yeah, I think Jonathan told me about this. What is
Yeah,
it again?
MGTOW, MGTOW, men going their own way.
Men going their own way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a WGTOW movement right now in
Oh, is
Korea,
there?
right?
Okay.
Women, yeah, no, like that was
Oh,
like,
yeah, the 4B.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
4B, yeah, and that's
Mm,
WGTOW. That's exactly the same thing.
okay. Mm.
Um, uh, and when I heard that, like, if in when there's some like, like Korean culture is like, you want to talk about like a racist, misogynistic culture, go to fucking Korea. There's some like very extreme, severe social restrictions there. It's pretty, like it's pretty understandable that some of those women feel like going their own way. That's kind of how I felt about the MGTOW movement. Like, you didn't you just say we were trash and we should shut up and get out? Like, we're getting out. Now I think like it then seems like it then just became a place also for people to pass around tropes about how nasty women were, and that that's clearly venomous and only going to lead to bad places.
Mm.
But as a concept, it seemed sort of understandable to me.
I keep thinking back to this conversation that I was part of back in probably late 2018. So maybe at the peak or just past the peak of that first category of the Me Too conversation that you were describing there. And I was in a group chat with a bunch of people, men and women, and sort of late one night, one of the guys popped up and said, "Hey, what should I do if I think I might have actually behaved kind of badly to some women in the past. I feel like maybe I might have engaged in some of this behavior. And what should I do about that? And I think, to the credit of the other people in the chat, people were sympathetic and understanding, and nobody said you should go jump off a bridge. Like, we were all as supportive as we could be without knowing any of the details. But yeah, as much as I resist this conclusion because I don't know that it was necessarily the responsibility of the movement to come up with this, I do continue to find myself thinking that the missing piece was that path to repair, that answer to that young guy. What should I do? I personally really do believe in repair, in change and forgiveness. I think sometimes that needs to be done through legal channels, but a lot of the behavior that I think forms part of this conversation doesn't fit neatly into a legal category. It fits into the category of, yeah, just making women's lives slightly worse all the time. And there's ways to stop doing that. There's ways to apologize for having done that, and ways to act differently. I don't know.
No.
I don't know if
I'm with you in
right about
thinking
that,
like,
but
well, no, I'm with you definitely in thinking like it's very hard to say like this is the responsibility of a movement, because again, like movements tend to be defined from the outside. Like a lot of women
yeah.
were upset and suddenly felt like they were able to speak in public about something, and then, as happens anytime there's a lot of emotion and a lot of attention being paid, people start chiming in for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's the lesson I learned the first time I went to any protest was like, there was a specific evil institution we were there to protest, but like the biggest, loudest people were there for legalizing weed and promoting anarchism.
Yeah.
I mean, like, hey, I understand a little bit of anarchism. I think legalizing, and I'm not a smoker, but I think legalizing weed is probably a good thing. But that we were there to protest the fucking School of the Americas, and what ended up happening literally is they shut it down and changed the name and then opened it back up, which feels like a perfect emblem for so many of these movements. For Black Lives Matter movement, for the Me Too movement, we shut down the bad institution, changed the name, and opened it back up. But
yeah, none of the power structures
you got your
have been
way changing the
changed.
name, right?
Yeah. And you got your way showing people exactly what they're not allowed to do in public.
Yes.
But all the power structures are exactly the same, if not worse. Everyone who benefited from them is still benefiting from them, unless, with the minimal exceptions of the people who are in jail. Yeah, I just can't get away from these incredibly dark conclusions. Just go and talk to your women friends, the women in your life. Just ask them. You don't have to listen to me. Just ask them.
Well, without putting you on the spot to talk about your own experience, play that out a little bit, if you would. Because I think it's good. I think it's a good advice. I think it's good advice to go ask most people, but like specifically in this case, talk to the women, say like, hey, have you had experiences like this? We'll play that out a little bit.
Well, the reason I say that is that I think it is so much a part of the fabric of life that there's a pretty good chance that things have happened that the women in your life haven't bothered to tell you because it just didn't seem that important. But maybe when you hear it, it'll surprise you.
Yeah.
Now, I was surprised to hear that this guy friend of mine was surprised.
Yeah.
But nothing like actually surprises me. I'm going to do something that might break my brain, but it's just an experiment. I'm just going to try it. One of the secrets of podcasting is that recording the intro to the show sucks. It's the worst part of making a show because you go in totally cold. You've got to get all this information across. You're thinking about the episode and like, how are you going to make it make sense to everybody? How are you going to convey all this important context? And it's hell. And often the intro is the thing that you have to do a million times over. So I'm going to do it backwards. I'm doing it backwards. This is my experiment. I'm recording the outro first. So this is me. I just switched the microphone on. I'm babbling. I've got no idea what I'm saying. I'll probably cut all this out. What happens in the secret show half of this conversation? Well, we keep coming back to the thorny stuff. It doesn't get any less complex or difficult, but we have a slight change of focus because another issue that we wanted to tackle here was this question of poetry insiders versus outsiders. This was an issue that came up in the conversation that we had with our listener who contacted us. And I did a bunch of thinking and writing about it on my own, and I sent some notes to Matthew, and we dug into it a little bit. And I think it is connected because I think if you're talking about power, particularly if you're talking about poetry, which can be such an opaque, weird world where the rules are just not the same as in other areas of life, being an insider can be a really, really vital way to get to power. So we talk a bit about that. We talk a little bit at the end about what we want specifically from a poetry conference. I think the SLEERICKETS conference is maybe a couple of years away, but I think it might be there on the horizon. I'm just being a complete ratbag by saying that. So, look, having edited that back, having given it a good airbrush, I feel like we did a better job than it felt like on the day, at least to me. But obviously this is not easy territory. I've been thinking a lot about like what kind of feminist I am these days. I came into my feminist consciousness properly really in like the early to mid 2000s. And it wasn't that I went off and read Germaine Greer or The Second Sex or anything like that. I am reading The Second Sex now, and it is quite scary how up to date it feels. But I wasn't reading any of that. I was just on the internet reading feminist blogs, Feminist, Feministing, Jezebel before it went really bad. That's where I first started reading Gia Tolentino, who I still read today. It was a back and forth. It was a conversation the whole time. There was never spiteful disagreement. It felt like the community was small enough that these ideas could be discussed and hashed out. I don't know, it's not that we came to like easy conclusions about anything, but there was a sense of something being built. Like people on those blogs would talk about being part of a third wave. It is kind of devastating to think of that now as like a relic. None of those conversations, I mean, so much has been obliterated in such a short amount of time. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get dark again because this conversation's already dark enough. I needed to just leave you with, if you're still here with me, another little note from Alice's Movie Corner. I really need theme music for this. So look, you know Honora, you know Sean Baker made this movie, Honora, with Mikey Madsen in it. You know it won Best Picture. I'm pretty sure you haven't seen it. That's okay. That's okay. There's still a lot of time for you to watch this movie, and I think you should. One of the things that struck me as I was editing this is that, like, it rarely goes that well. I think we did a pretty, like, you know, if I do say so myself, I think we did a decent job. But rarely does it go well when you get a man and a woman in a room and you say, hey, talk about feminism and sex and power. In my 20s, what this looked like was the boys were playing Grand Theft Auto in the lounge room, and I had some bee in my bonnet, and I would march into the lounge room and be like, hey, what you guys don't get is, and they'd be like, we're playing Grand Theft Auto. And it just didn't go well. They were not interested in being yelled at, which is weird, but they didn't like it. And over time, I learned to just stop having these conversations at all. But where I think it's still entirely possible to get messages about sex and power across really effectively is in narrative, and I think specifically in film. And Honora does it. Sean Baker does this in Honora so beautifully. Just, it's not a perfect film, but it is an excellent film, particularly when it comes to looking at these issues. It's a story about a sex worker called Honora and what happens when she meets a very rich young Russian guy. It's a movie in two halves, big, sparkly, triumphant first half and very different second half. It shows the circularity of this power dynamic and what happens when women's power runs out so effectively. I really think you should watch it. It's not going to be a waste of your time. But here is the deal. And I know you're not going to like this, but this is the rule. Before you watch Honora, you have to watch Pretty Woman. And I feel like I'm allowed to say that because I've seen The Godfather and I actually really liked it. It's just so important that you watch Pretty Woman. Honora is a remake of Pretty Woman. So that's one reason you're going to miss so much of what the movie is doing if you haven't seen Pretty Woman first. But also, Pretty Woman is like a spectacular movie. I first saw it when I was 14. I've been watching it at least once a year ever since. It has done severe psychological damage to me, and it is just a flawless work of genius. If you've never heard Julia Roberts saying, "Big mistake, huge," if you don't know about the $3,000, if you don't know about I say when, I say where, I say how much, like, I don't know how are you living? It's so important that you go and watch Pretty Woman. And that's the rule. You can't watch Honora unless you watch it first. It's a beautiful double feature. It's a perfect evening. I just sorted out your Friday night. All right. To hear the second half of this conversation, you need to go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, plug in your email. You'll get a week's access for free. It's not that expensive afterwards. You can get in touch with Matthew at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. You can get in touch with me still at poetrysayspod@gmail.com if you have solutions to this problem that you want to share with us. Thank you all for listening. This really is breaking my brain. How do I do the last bit? Thank you all for listening. And with any luck, we will be speaking to you again very soon.